My name is Dean Mosher. I am first and foremost a Fairhopian, have been for approximately 50 years. Married a Fairhope girl 43 years ago, but was good friends with her parents prior to that. My career has evolved. I've always wanted to be an artist since I was a child, and have large historical art paintings all over the country. Smithsonian Institution, Naval Academy, Coast Guard Academy, University of Virginia, University of Alabama, et cetera, National Park Visitors Centers. I'm the only living artist in the Smithsonian, supposedly. That's a title I intend to hold on to as long as possible, because someday it won't be true. I am an author, designer, builder, have built a couple of homes and refurbished several in our little mystical neighborhood that we have in Fairhope. We call it the Shire. My wife was a principal ballet dancer when we were married, and that took up a number of years, and then she started the Creative Outlet Dance Center and ran that for 40 years. I have also been Historian General of the Naval Order of the United States, was able to do a great deal with the Navy to build the only monument to the Navy on D-Day in Normandy. I have spoken to Surface Navy. I have, with the Smithsonian and related experiences there, I've been able to meet Neil Armstrong and John Glenn, and was absolutely surrounded by the heroes that I grew up with. When I was very young in school, the only thing they brought black and white televisions into the schoolrooms for, we didn't have color in those days, was the NASA program and the launches, especially the moon launches. So to be able to meet Neil Armstrong on several occasions was remarkable. Mainly is very lucky to have married my wife of 43 years to this point, two beautiful kids, both of whom are artists. I don't think you're allowed to be anything else in our family but an artist, because that's what we have been for quite some time. And look forward to a few more years at least of being productive, finishing projects. In the Spirit of Fairhope book, the premise of the Spirit of Fairhope book was to ask an awful lot of people, many of them very famous, what they felt was the identity or spirit of Fairhope, and each one has a very different approach to what they consider the spirit of Fairhope, but all of it's incredibly positive. The genesis of the book came from Karin Wilson, who is the second generation owner and operator of the Page and Palette Bookstore, one of the finest in the United States. The book came from my going in and talking to her. Well, I just stop by periodically and go back and we chat in the office. And basically, after one of our conversations, she pulled out an imaginary gun and said, "You're going to put this down in a book," because it is true. I have had an incredible life here in Fairhope. And from the very beginnings, when I came here about age 20, I fell in with unbelievably incredible people. The genesis for all of that was Cleveland Woodward. Cleveland Woodward was one of the world's finest maritime artists. He was also one of the world's leading biblical illustrators. He had studied at the British Academy of Rome in the 1920s. He had gone back, lived most of his life in Cape Cod, where he worked for every major publication as an illustrator and an artist. While he was in Truro on Cape Cod, which is where he moved, he started a coffee club in the summertime. And the reason he started the coffee club is everybody in the world came to Cape Cod in the summertime. Half of Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, for example, came to Cape Cod at least, and would come to the coffee club. Norman Mailer would come to the coffee club, and it only had two simple rules. You could not try to extract help from anyone for any project or ideal subject that you were interested in, couldn't sell anything, and you kept it to philosophical discussion. And it was a huge success. And when he moved to Fairhope in the 1950s, he and his wife, Emmy, found the Grand Hotel and then came to Fairhope and decided to buy a house there, which they did on Boone Lane. And he taught periodically at the Eastern Shore Art Center. And I came over because I'd been offered a job to teach at the Eastern Shore Art Center at the tender age of about 20, and came over to observe one of his classes, because I'd been told and had heard by reputation what a phenomenal human being it was, and came in and met him and decided to move to Fairhope. I was living in Mobile at the time, doing construction work. And so I moved to Fairhope on a wing and a prayer, and that evolved to where my friendship with Cleveland Woodward evolved, and he invited me to come join the coffee club. Now, the coffee club in Fairhope was made up of a group of phenomenal human beings of all walks of life, artists, statesmen, directors of national galleries, architects, tremendous people, PhDs all over the place. And I was the youngest by about 50 years at the time. So I basically spent 7 years sitting at the feet of the highest accumulation of knowledge I could ever conceive of, and listening, if you can imagine me listening. But at the time I did. And all I did was absorb and learn. And some of these people knew the founders of Fairhope, the ones that are mentioned in the book. I mean, going back to 1895. So with that, one of the members of the coffee club was a brilliant wood carver, master carpenter, writer, Craig Sheldon. And it's hard not to fall in love with Craig. And his wife, Annie, she was called Butch. He renamed everything in his life. His son was named Mac because everyone in the Marine Corps was either called Mac or Butch. And so his wife became Butch and his son became Mac, to which he is known on to this day. My wife's older sister was named Megrez after the star that my then engaged mother-in-law and father-in-law would go out where they were in disparate parts of the world. They would pick a time and a day where they could go out at the same time, adjusting for the timelines where they were, respectively, and they could look up at the same object at the same time. And that became their source of communication, which I just think is absolutely romantic and fabulous. And so their daughter was named Megrez, their older daughter. My wife was named Pagan because Craig, her daddy, had lived on the Pagan Islands for a while in the Marine Corps and thought they were the most Christian people he'd ever met, and decent people. We met several years after I met Craig. I didn't even know he had daughters because Pagan was off dancing and Susan Megrez was off in Boston and other places. I just knew the Sheldons lived in a phenomenal house, and he was a phenomenal craftsman, and he was a wonderful friend. He sort of contrived for me to meet his daughter when she came back home from Birmingham, and I did. And I told her I was going to marry her on the first date, and I proposed on the second. And so that's all there was to it, as far as I'm concerned, and still is. Here we have two wonderful children. One is Cleveland, named after Cleveland Woodward, and the other is Megrez, named after the star. They're both artists. I don't think you're allowed to be anything else in our family but an artist. It's just there. But the book, in meeting all of these people, and of course there's a synergy that divides out from there as you move around, where you meet other people and stories begin to accumulate and overlap and get confirmed from other sources or slightly changed due to a little thing called the truth on other stories. But as you start to get a feeling of this, then you start understanding that Fairhope was unique, but why was it unique? And as it turns out, we were founded on a book that was published in 1879 called Progress and Poverty by an internationally known figure named Henry George. In fact, when Progress and Poverty came out in 1879, it sold out every book but the Bible for 3 years. And so millions of copies were sold, and it was about single tax. And single tax had to do with land ownership versus a community-owned land ownership, which was a very different proposition. Henry George argued that it was large landowners that kept their power by holding their lessees and renters under their thumb. And that's very true. It's still true. So our founders came up with the idea of not just having a single tax club, there were hundreds of them all over the United States, all over the world. They decided they were going to form a colony. So in Des Moines, Iowa, in 1894, they had a meeting, and they decided on their constitution, which had been very carefully written, and a plan to implement how they were going to make the colony. And a man in the back of the room stood up named Alf Wooster after all this had passed unanimously and said, I think this has a fair hope of success. So that's how Fairhope was named. So they sent out various people to look for land, places to build their utopian community. And they came here, among other places, but they decided that this was a place, hands down, to come and start their colony. So on November 15th, 1895, they arrived here most of them by steamer, some by covered wagon or Conestoga wagon, and they had the roundup on November 15th, and they decided to go in and start buying land. The first block was the land they bought along the bay. Sarah Tatum, who owned the land, after she signed the deed over to the single taxer, said, well, I hope you do something with it. And their intent was not to do anything with it, for the most part. That's what our parkland constitutes, largely today. And they said that if you take the land that was largely north and south of here, and still is to this day, dominated by people of great wherewithal, or the wealthy, you might as well live in Nebraska for all the bayfront you get to enjoy. But in Fairhope, you have virtually over a mile of open parkland on the bay, and a pier you can go down and walk on, and all of these lovely green spaces that are scattered around, that our founders said, if you leave these places open for all people to enjoy, that it won't just create a good sense of community value, it'll also make it more valuable. And my God, that has proven to be true 1,000 times over. Fairhope is just a magic spot, and the fact that we have the parklands still to this day. Go north or south of here and see how much bayfront you have access to, unless you know somebody. Well, you don't have to know somebody in Fairhope. It's there. So that's a very important part. And I joined the Single Tax Corporation. You have to be elected. You have to take a course. I even taught the course. We were very active. We didn't generally do all of anything. We generally worked in partnerships with both individuals and the city government to build things like Centennial Hall. That was to commemorate our 100th anniversary. And I helped design that building. And then the library was very active in supporting the library and contributed the design for the big stained glass window that's in there, and helped with the Giddens Auditorium that's there, because the Giddens were good friends, still are. The Fairhope Museum, the building is the Oswald Building, which was built in 1927. A couple of our councilmen at the time decided that they wanted to tear it down and have somebody build condominiums there. And knowing it was a historic building and being on the council, Single Tax Council, I got permission to go up with the structural engineer through the Oswald Building, where they said was rotting down, and found out it was sound as a dollar. So we decided, with the anniversary of the city coming up, that we'd kick in $750,000, and the city would kick in $750,000. And I designed the big gallery section on the back of the building, and we built that, kept the plaza green space there, because I know that green spaces in your downtown area are some of the most valuable real estate you could have, and they were quickly disappearing at that point. So the plaza was to be open and green. And then the fountain in the center was raised by the Pelican project we did. My father-in-law created the Pelican sculpture on the corner of Fairhope Avenue and Bancroft on the Faulkner campus. That was Fairhope's first piece of public art, and that was back in 1990. So very much involved on that one also. Did the painting of the founders in the museum. There's been a lot of contributions I've tried to make to Fairhope, because that's just what you do. It's part of your responsibility as a citizen to try to make your community better. So we need to, that's our new goal, and it should be, to help keep Fairhope growing the way it should, and to keep our quality of life going, because there are people that would sell us out and move away and be done with it, and we can't let that happen. So with all that, the genesis for the book was to coalesce all of these stories in a picture book fashion, be able to bring in the famous authors. I mean, I didn't mention Winston Groom earlier, but he also contributed their thoughts on how you define the spirit of Fairhope, and then go through the history, starting chronologically from the beginning and moving up through onto today. Let's begin at the beginning. You see this beautiful cover on the spirit of Fairhope. That was painted by Joe Patton, who has captured more than any other artist who's ever lived here, the spirit of Fairhope and her fabulous oils and watercolors that she does. There was never a question her art was going to be on the cover of this book. She is known and loved and deserves it. So this is her cover art. One of the things that I've done over the years, especially when we were approaching our centennial in '94 and on up to the time of this, of the book, is there were a lot of photographic collections that were being disseminated around, and valuable photographs and images were being lost. So I put the word out in the community through Single Tax that we wanted to gather photographic collections. Because for years when I was doing documentaries or other visual things about Fairhope, we had a shoebox in the safe at the Single Tax Corporation that held about 200 photographs. And sometimes it was 190 photographs or 180, or some of them didn't get back. And so all these single shot prints were disappearing, or some of them. So the word was out. If you bring them to us, we will document them, we will pay to have them digitized, we will have them put on a server that's available to everyone. Well, one of the gold mines, and we got several, was the Dealey Brown's Jennings collection. And Pop Dealey, who appears in some of the early cartoons about Fairhope and was a big documenter of Fairhope's history, took phenomenal photographs like this, the Fairhope Light Opera Company. But there are close to 2,500 images that we got that we were able to preserve and put on servers. So they're hopefully forever. I did a big display for the hospital, the emergency room at Thomas Hospital, and it is filled with Dealey's photographs and lots of other historical things. We also had Bruce Larson's son, Brock, who grew up in our house with my son and all of his friends in and around Fairhope. Stephen Savage, one of the best photographers ever in this area. We just had wonderful contributors to the photographs of this area. We picked them according to the contributions of who was writing, the author. This one, for example, was my brother-in-law, Dr. Craig Sheldon, probably one of the top archaeologists in the world, and the top archaeologist in the world on pre-Columbian and Native Americans, and also the most knowledgeable person I've ever met in my life. There is not a thing he doesn't know about. But we also wanted to capture the uniqueness of Fairhope. This, of course, is called Leap of Faith, and it's taken at the Fairhope Yacht Club. We also do the history of that in there. We also have the author's contributions. Some of them are just a paragraph, others are several pages long of what they think defines Fairhope and its beauty. The Bay Boat era was phenomenal. It went from 1905 to 1933. And that's when the causeway was built in 27, and the bay boat traffic sort of had to be taken over by the causeway and people and motor cars being more reliable, et cetera. So as we get up through, and we had, there are lots of humorous and other stories about the bay boats that are well worth telling, and we cover that in the book to great length. Pico, of course, wrote that section of the book. Then you talk about the piers. There were a number of highly used piers, but the Fairhope Pier, of course, was the premier pier on the Eastern Shore. And it was a big part of our growth. We have pictures of the original pier, which was kind of low and narrow that went out half a mile. And then in the late 60s, they built the pier that's still there to this day. But we have great pictures and stories about the pier in there and its history. Fanny Flagg, who's a good friend, wrote the screenplay for Fried Green Tomatoes. On the other, we live on one end of Oak Street. She was on the other end. writing about Fairhope, and she contributed to the book, and we have a portion there about the book signing we gave to Fanny years later. We get into the casino. There was a huge building when you went down the hill that was called the casino. Now, a casino in those days wasn't a gambling casino. A casino was where you went and changed clothing to go swim. This was in the days when women would go into a changing room and literally come out with more clothing on than they went in, because women had to be covered, literally from the neck to their ankles. And so, rather cumbersome. At the same time, Fairhope built a reputation as being a nudist colony, because an awful lot of people, we didn't have running water for decades in Fairhope. A lot of people would just walk out with a towel wrapped around them, go down to the bay, and bathe. There were springs all along the bay. So, you take a bar of soap and you go down and do your ablution down there and come back home. And so that's where the nudist colony came from. There was never any organized nudist colony. It was just a people that went down and liked to be clean, and that was a good place to get clean, was the bay, and the springs near the bay. Interestingly enough, there was a lady named Lizzie Maggie who developed a game called the landlord's game, based on single tax theory, which later became Monopoly. But the first landlord's game was to show single tax principles. And so the first board game has Johnson Street and several streets on here that are named for Fairhope or Fairhope streets. We still have in Fairhope, in private hands, one of these boards, which was, I think, kind of neat. And Mr. Stimson, who owned one of the two main sawmills, he made little toy markers like chess pieces and other game board pieces with his sawmill and his little factory on that. We still have Stimson Field over there that he gave to the city. And so that's another one of the many wonderful stories that are on there. We also had Devil's Hole, which is near the yacht club and part of the beautiful spring that was back there, long since changed from there. We have a big section on the parklands and the importance of the parklands and how we've had to protect the parklands, because, believe it or not, there have been rather unscrupulous and greedy individuals over the years who have wanted to try to nullify the public ownership of the parks to build profitable activities for themselves. Now, I know you can't conceive of somebody being greedy enough to want to do something like that, but it does happen occasionally. But we have always protested and protected that happening. Had a number of battles on that. Gullies. We have some of the oldest watershed protection areas in the world, 1895 in Fairhope. The reason for that was when the first settlers came here, they found the land was cheap. The reason the land was cheap is in the late 1800s, a railroad line was built from the main line, which is north, down to the center of Foley. And that was full of Swedes with axes on their shoulders. And they proceeded to cut down an awful lot of Baldwin County. There was a joke when the Fairhopers first got here that you could stand on a stump in Fairhope and see all the way to Spanish Fort, because they basically cut down all the timber, which was old growth pine. That also caused massive erosion. And we have fabulous pictures of the open gullies and the erosion-scarred gullies of the time, because of the forethought of our founders to set aside these various watersheds. They're beautiful, grown-up green areas now that absorb the water on a beautiful basis for the rest of the town. Otherwise, they too would be watered and channeled. And other than a few instances I'm aware of in our 100-plus year history, it's done an absolutely incredible job. In the beginning, we had the very first waterworks in Fairhope, which was a hand pump that was put in the middle of the road, basically at Fairhope and Section Street, that then led to a water tower in the middle of the street. There are lots of wonderful stories, and I'm glad we don't have to contend with that anymore. We have a pretty good waterworks. The wide streets, the reason we have wide streets on several of our avenues is because they understood that if they built buildings on both sides of a narrow street, that eventually they were going to have to tear down one side or the other as they grew, because cities were doing that at the turn of the century all over. Well, what does a wide street mean in 1895? Because cars were virtually non-existent. So they said, let's get a team of 4 and a wagon, And whatever it takes to turn that wagon around in the middle of the street is how wide we'll make the streets. So that's why Fairhope Avenue, Magnolia Avenue, Fells Avenue start off as very wide streets, so that then you can turn a horse around, but now you can have at least 2 lanes of traffic with a turning lane and diagonal parking all the way down the street. The Grand Hotel precedes Fairhope by about 50 years. And you can't have a discussion about Fairhope without including the Grand Hotel, because the patrons of the Grand Hotel have been coming to Fairhope and helping the merchants and their families come down and stay in the inns in Fairhope and so on and so forth. So we had a railroad. We had the first phone service in the whole area. Of course, it only had 21 people, I think, attached to it, and it was a party line, but it still was a phone service. Medical history. We've had a very interesting medical history in Fairhope. We had one of the first pharmacies. First pharmacy was across the street from where Jewel is now. But Dr. Mosher, who suffered from tuberculosis, built a sanitarium in Fairhope, a rather large one, for people to come and convalesce there. And Dr. Goodard came here. There's a fabulous story about Dr. Goodard in the book that was told to me by Jerry Burkhart. But Dr. Goodard helped start Thomas Hospital, along with Moon Mullins, that was his nickname, and several others that I got to meet and know. And Thomas, of course, is one of the premier medical centers in this whole area. Then I go into a number of the famous early Fairhopians, some of the stories, some of which are both informative and humorous on that. We had the first building built as a library in the state of Alabama. And that was a result of Marie Howland coming down here. She was an author. She had the temerity to suggest that a woman should be able to pick the man she wanted in life. And so at the turn of the century, this just wasn't done. So Marie was just a fabulous character and contributor to Fairhope. Marietta Johnson. One of my first jobs in Fairhope was to teach art at the organic school. Marietta Johnson founded the organic school in 1907. Her sense was that children need to be rounded individuals and to give them the freedom to learn and not try to pigeonhole them into specific subjects. It was a wide-ranging, very humanistic way to do education, and it was incredibly successful. She was a lecturer all over the country and the world and had large patrons like Mrs. Henry Ford and Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. I also have a picture of Mr. Woodward, the coffee club, including my father-in-law. My father-in-law is one of the progenitors of the Arts and Crafts Festival. Craig always had the hardware store window where he would display his carvings every year. And of course, it was the third weekend in March as it became established, and now you'll have over 250,000 people come in for the 3-day festival. And it's mayhem, but it's wonderful. It's one of the reasons there's a statue of Craig at the museum, because he was a legendary carver. His wood carvings were solicited by the Metropolitan Museum and are just absolutely incredibly unique and wonderful, just like the man was. I have lots of stories about lots of people here, some of which my wife grew up with and a lot of which I got to know. World War II, we had an awful lot of people who went, fought, and came back, and some who didn't. The arts, there's a wonderful section, thanks to so many people in Fairhope contributing to the legacy of the arts from our earliest days, and people who gave a great deal of their time and energy to bring the arts to Fairhope and keep them going, many of whom were giants in their own right, Flo May Schermerhorn and Gretchen Riggs, among others. But we've had lots of thespians. Some of the sculpture and things that we have, contributors like Bruce Larson, Stephen Spears. The Eastern Shore Arts Center has had a very interesting history. The lights in the trees that we have grew out of Hurricane Frederick that took out almost every tree in downtown Fairhope when it hit in 1979. And we had a German doctor named Howard Wolf, who was in the Wehrmacht in World War II. He came to Fairhope, and he was well accepted in the Rotary Club and other places. And Jim Nick said, "You're in charge, Howard." So he gave him some money and time, and that's where a lot of the trees and things came from, downtown, and the flowers. And you couldn't stop planting flowers now if you wanted to. Even though it's very expensive and time-consuming and takes up a lot, it's absolutely part of the identity of Fairhope now. And I'm glad we do it. It's absolutely lovely and unique. John Borum was instrumental in bringing Faulkner to the old organic school site, which had deteriorated. And John was a marine biologist, and he was the first man to define what caused jubilees, which only happen in 2 places in the world. One is on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay. But he's the one that explained that basically in August, for the most part, when it gets very hot and the water in the bay is very still and the heat permeates into the water and raises the temperature, and because the water doesn't move very quickly, it causes an oxygen shortage. And what happens is pockets of water with no oxygen in late August and sometimes early September, an easterly wind will start blowing that pocket, and the fish can't breathe in it, so they move in front of it, and it literally drives them up onto shore. And that's where jubilees come from. And the old-timers, there were a number of old-timers who knew in August, when the weather conditions were the way they were and the wind was heading in the right direction, there was going to be a jubilee. And one phone call would generate 200 phone calls, and people would come down at 3 and 4 in the morning with ice chests, buckets, anything they could find, and fill up seafood, because the crabs would literally walk up on shore. My wife remembers at about age 3 being set on a log in the darkness and left there, and with only flashlight beams as everyone was out gathering up the seafood. I mean, shrimp, crabs, flounder, everything. And we go into sports and yacht club history and library history and the Page and Palette history and Fanny Flagg's visit to do our one and only national book signing at our castles, and how we had almost right at 1,000 people come down. And because their book was Can't Wait to Get to Heaven, we decided we would have a heavenly event, and everyone was to dress in white. So this massive crowd of people dressed only in white, and in typical Fanny Flagg improvisation, she said, "I feel like every insane asylum in the South has been emptied out to come hear me talk." And of course, the crowd roared with approval, and she was only going to speak for about 10 minutes, but she ended up reading to us from the book magically for about 40 minutes. And so that was a wonderful event. Fairhope is changing all the time, and luckily we try to hold on to our traditions. We are always going to have to make people aware of what the important things are, the protection of the parklands and the beauty of the town and the sense of welcomeness that needs to be always preserved, if at all possible. So that's basically the story of the book. I hope you'll get a copy and read it, because a lot of work and effort, and there are fabulous photographs in there. And so with that, I will bid you adieu.